Welcome to the Explainer. I want you to imagine, just for a second, the vast, sweeping grasslands of the steppes, stretching endlessly across the south of what we now know as Russia and Ukraine. For thousands of years, these lands were silent, home only to nomadic tribes and mysterious Bronze Age cultures. It's a geographical scale so epic, it's honestly almost impossible to comprehend. And today, we're going to trace the breathtaking journey of how this immense, silent landscape somehow gave rise to the largest empire on Earth. For literally thousands of years, the only records these early people left behind were their graves, these massive mounds of earth we call kurgans. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus called them the Scythians, but when we zoom out, you kind of have to ask yourself, how does a land defined by silent Bronze Age burial mounds end up birthing a sprawling, unstoppable empire? How did the Slavs, and later Scandinavian Vikings known as Varangians, actually forge a nation?
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, from Kurgan to Kievan Rus. So, legend has it, this whole thing kicked off around 862 AD, when Eastern Slavs asked a Viking leader named Rurik to unite their tribes. Rurik sets up shop in Novgorod and founds a dynasty that's going to stick around for 700 years. His people, the Rus, rapidly built up a brand new state, Kievan Rus. Then, in a totally pivotal moment in 988 AD, Vladimir the Great adopts Orthodox Christianity, permanently locking in the region's cultural and spiritual DNA. By 1019, under Yaroslav the Wise, Kievan Rus hits this magnificent golden age, literally standing toe-to-toe with the most advanced states in Europe. But it didn't last. Sweeping in from the east, the Mongols, led by Genghis Khan's successors, just completely erased this golden era, burning down cities and decimating the population.
Which brings us to Section 2, Mongol invasion and the first Tsars.
Now, the sheer trauma of that Mongol invasion basically forced Russian princes to centralize absolute power, just to survive. Living under what was called the Tatar yoke birthed this incredibly iron-fisted ruling style that defined Russian history for centuries. And this brilliantly illustrates the era. Ivan IV, yeah, you probably know him as Ivan the Terrible, he was the first to actually be crowned Tsar, and he perfectly embodies this absolutely stark dual legacy. On one hand, he massively expanded the state into Siberia, conquered Tatar lands, and totally modernized the military, a real game changer. But on the other hand, that modernization was fueled by extreme paranoia and a literal reign of terror. We're talking mass executions and, tragically, even striking his own son dead. So, state survival? Sure, but it came at a terrifying human cost.
And when Ivan's lineage finally ended, Russia plunged headfirst into an era of total anarchy known as the Time of Troubles. Just let this fraction sink in for a second. 1/3. A full third of the entire Russian population was wiped out during this period by this horrific cocktail of civil war, famine, and plague. Rebellions were raging everywhere. Foreign armies from Poland and Sweden were occupying key cities, including Moscow. Honestly, the Russian state was on the absolute brink of extinction.
Section 3, Romanovs and New Russia. Miraculously, Russia clawed its way back from the brink in 1613 when an assembly elected a 16-year-old kid, Mikhail Romanov, as Tsar. This established a brand new dynasty that would rule with absolute, unquestioned authority for the next 300 years. But here's the catch. As the empire stabilized and grew, personal freedoms rapidly vanished. We really need to clearly define the dark underbelly of the empire's glittering rise, and that is serfdom. A serf was a peasant legally bound to a master's land. They had zero freedom to travel, absolutely no right to choose their master, and the worst part, this deeply subjugated status was permanently inherited by their children. They were, in everything but name, slaves.
Under Tsar Alexei, who was Mikhail's son, a new legal code officially trapped a staggering 80% of the Russian population into serfdom. Think about that number. For the next 2 centuries, this wildly oppressive system completely dominated Russian rural life. They were essentially building the empire's immense wealth on the backs of millions of unfree people. And that brings us to a Tsar who perfectly embodied the paradox of Russian autocracy, Peter the Great. This guy was completely obsessed with transforming Russia into a modern European powerhouse. He built Russia's very first modern navy, advanced science, and totally revamped the military from the ground up. But his execution was ruthlessly autocratic. I mean, he literally forced nobles to adopt European dress and hit them with taxes just for having beards. And chillingly, he built his grand new capital, St. Petersburg, on a literal swamp. It was a monumental, jaw-dropping achievement, for sure, but it was built on the bones of thousands of serfs who lost their lives constructing it. Moving along, Section 4, Enlightenment and the Fracturing Empire. By the time we hit the 1700s, progressive European ideals were starting to seep into Russia, and they were seriously clashing with autocratic realities. Enter the ultimate enlightened autocrat, Catherine the Great. She was a German princess who actually overthrew her own husband, and she became a master at balancing these opposing forces. Now, what's really interesting about this side is how you can see that dual reality. On one side, she built universities, championed the arts by founding the Hermitage, and was literally pen pals with the French philosopher Voltaire. But look at the other side. When the massive Pugachev peasant rebellion threatened her rule, she crushed it without a second of mercy. And she forced Russia's large Jewish population to live exclusively in restricted, segregated zones known as the Pale of Settlement. The 19th century was just a roller coaster of wild, turbulent swings for the Russian Empire. In 1812, Russia achieved this incredible, legendary glory by defeating Napoleon Bonaparte's massive invasion, basically using the brutal Russian winter to absolutely destroy the French army. But, victory abroad didn't fix the glaring problems at home. In 1825, a military revolt demanding a constitution, called the Decembrist Revolt, was ruthlessly crushed. Fast forward to the 1850s, and the empire's technological backwardness gets violently exposed during a humiliating defeat in the Crimean War. Finally realizing that change was absolutely vital for survival, Tsar Alexander II abolishes serfdom in 1861, which earned him the nickname of the Liberator.
And just to throw a totally surprising historical fact into this era of massive change, $7.2 million. That was the exact price tag for which Alexander II sold the territory of Alaska to the United States. Yup, the whole shebang. At the time, a lot of Americans thought it was a complete and utter waste of money. Well, that is until the region's immense gold and oil reserves were finally discovered years later. But there's a really tragic irony to the reforms of Alexander II. By opening up society just a tiny bit, he inadvertently unleashed these radical political forces. Ultimately, he was assassinated by left-wing terrorists who threw a bomb at his carriage right in St. Petersburg. Now, his son, Alexander III, he looked at that and believed his father's reforms were a fatal, catastrophic mistake. He actually declared that the voice of God commanded him to courageously undertake the task of ruling with faith in the strength and truth of autocratic power. So what does he do? He violently snaps the pendulum right back. He cracks down hard on revolutionaries using his secret police and firmly roots his entire rule in 3 pillars: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Which brings us to the breaking point. Section 5, 1917, the fall of the Romanovs. All that hardline repression from the late 19th century basically set the stage for an explosive 20th century. Tsar Nicholas II inherited an empire that was modernizing economically, but politically, it was a total powder keg. Let's move to and see how this builds, because the fractures compound so rapidly. First up, the Hadinka tragedy, where 1,400 people were tragically crushed to death in a stampede during Nicholas's own coronation. Not a great start. Then, a shocking and humiliating military defeat to Japan. Fast forward to 1905, we get the fateful Bloody Sunday, where troops opened fire on a crowd of peaceful protesting workers, killing over 100 and sparking strikes across the entire nation. Add to all of that the scandalous, deeply damaging influence of the Siberian mystic Grigory Rasputin on the royal family, and you've got an empire rapidly losing its legitimacy in the eyes of its own people.
But the final catalyst, the thing that completely broke the Russian system once and for all, was World War I. A quick wave of initial patriotism just completely dissolved into unbearable hardship. The Russian army was suffering colossal, mind-boggling casualties on the front lines against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Back home, economic mismanagement led to skyrocketing prices and severe, desperate food shortages, especially in the capital Petrograd. Driven completely by hunger and desperation, workers took to the streets. But this time, when the troops were ordered to shoot the starving protesters, they refused. Actually, they didn't just refuse, they crossed the lines and joined them.
The collapse of 300 years of Romanov rule happened with dizzying, almost unbelievable speed. Realizing he had completely lost control of the army and the capital, Tsar Nicholas II abdicates the throne. A new republic is declared, and a provisional government takes power. But they make the disastrous choice to stay in the war, completely failing to stabilize the plunging economy. So power rapidly shifts to the streets. Workers and soldiers form these incredibly powerful rival councils known as Soviets, and promising peace, land, and bread. Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and the Bolshevik Party capitalize on the total chaos.
In October 1917, they storm the Winter Palace, arrest the government, and seize total control.
And that brings us to the end of this historical chapter, and it leaves us with a truly profound question. The 300-year Romanov dynasty was officially gone. In its place, a revolutionary party inspired by Karl Marx stood at the helm of a vast, broken, and deeply divided nation. Born from the blood of the czars and stepping immediately into the unimaginably brutal chaos of a looming civil war, what would the world's first Marxist state become? How far would the great pendulum of Russian history swing this time? Well, that is definitely something to ponder until our next explainer.